Well, I think we can get started. Judy, is that right? Judy Coleman? Yep. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I am Christiane Hanna, president of the AFP Chicago chapter this year and the director of development at Advance Illinois. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's presentation. Thank you for joining us and for being a part of AFP Chicago. Special thanks to the members of our Continuous Learning Council for developing today's program and bringing us all together. Now, it goes without saying, we're in the midst of some truly difficult and challenging times. I know that many of us are finding ourselves redoing all the plans we so carefully put into place back in January. It's important in moments like these that we as fundraising professionals stay connected and learn from each other as we learn how to navigate this new environment. I wanted to encourage everyone here to take advantage of your AFP membership. There are many ways membership allows you to get involved and engaged with other fundraising professionals through educational programs like these, our pop-up networking events, virtual Third Thursdays, and our affinity groups. We are here as AFP Chicago to be a resource for you and support you in your work. Now, I'd like to acknowledge, before we get started, our 2020 AFP Fellows here today. We have Vanessa Bonilla, Nina Eliza of Community Health, Ryan Jameson of Metro Squash, Ashley Lugo of Treehouse Humane Society, and Gabriel Packer of CARA. Welcome, Fellows. Thank you for joining us today. The Fellows program was created in 2004 to offer developmental professionals both educational resources and the collective professional expertise of our membership. Each fellow represents our rich and diverse Chicago philanthropy community. Thank you again for joining us here today. I'd also like to take a moment before we begin to thank our sponsors. Thanks to our pioneer sponsor, Advocate Aurora Health, for their generous support in funding our programming. I would also like to thank our IDEA Education Scholarship Fund sponsor, Campbell & Company. Both of these sponsors make it possible for today's program to be delivered to our members at no charge. We appreciate and thank our sponsors for their continued support of our chapter. If you could, Becky, turn it to the housekeeping slide. Before we get started, there's a couple of housekeeping items. To keep our audio as clear as possible, we have intentionally muted all of your lines. If you have a question for our panelists, please use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many questions as we can in this 1 hour time frame. Finally, an evaluation will be sent following today's presentation. It will include a link to a recording of today's session for you to review. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Judith Coleman, Major Gift Officer, Covenant House, Illinois, so we can begin our program. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Christiane, and I'd like to add my thanks to everyone for being here today, and thanks in advance to our speakers. I know this is going to be a wonderful session. So today we're bringing together 3 well-respected nonprofit professionals to talk with you about the working relationship between development and finance, how the pandemic has either changed, strained, or solidified some of the considerations. Today, our moderator is Tom Wick, Vice President, Principal and Major Gifts at Rush University Medical Center. And our 2 panelists are Angela Dowell, Chief Financial Officer at the Community Loan Fund, and Heather Simpson, Chief Development Officer of Make-A-Wish Foundation. So Tom, would you like to get us started?
I would, and I'm gonna be honest with everyone up front. In the new work from home world, I am about 10, 15 feet away from my wife who's on a phone call herself. So if you hear something from beyond me, I apologize in advance. I'll probably put myself on mute more often than not. I want to first thank Judy, AFP, for organizing this session. One thing that I think makes our profession noble is that we're willing to share. We're willing to educate ourselves. Even though we are in some level competing for the philanthropic pie in Chicago, here we are trying to help each other figure out how to do this work even better. So I really appreciate this opportunity to be a part of this session. I do want to set up the conversation with a little, I guess I'll call it a joke, and I don't know many jokes, but let me share it. And I know I can't see faces or hear, hopefully you'll get a little bit of a chuckle. But when I was in higher ed, I heard this. Someone said, well, when the chair of the board had to pick a new president, she went to the CFO and the chief development officer and asked one simple question: 2 + 2 = what? Well, of course, the CFO knew completely right away that that answer was 4. When she went to the chief development officer, the answer was, well, what do you want it to be? And I think that that shows how each of us care about the money, but we're coming at it in different ways. And I will say, early in my career, I looked at the finance folks more like the parents of a teenager. Whenever I was trying to get something to go out and make new friends, build new relationships, I felt like I was getting a no. But time and experience has proven that the finance department is an incredibly important partner in the work that we're doing, ultimately to make sure that our nonprofits have the kind of success, they're financed in the short term and the long term to fulfill the mission. It's a partnership that is so important. And finance people care as much about the mission of the place. They just want to make sure that the money, that the bottom line is met. And I think today's session, we're going to hear from Heather and Angela. It's going to not only demonstrate, but also describe how to build that partnership in a way that, even though we're coming at it from different perspectives, ultimately our nonprofits are financed short-term and long-term successfully. So with that, again, I'm going to ask some very simple questions and let Heather and Angela take it from there. And quite honestly, if you don't hear from me again, I know it's going to be a really good session. So let me start with my first question to both Angela and Heather. While finance and development are both focused on making sure the institution has the funds it needs to achieve its mission, what reasons or factors prompt each to approach this goal differently? Heather, why don't you start us?
Great. I think that it's different because we're looking at them from a different point of view. I think by nature, most gift officers are optimistic and most financial people are realistic. So there's this push-pull all the time of trying to figure out what may be achievable as we're working with the dreams of the donors that we're working with on a daily basis, versus analyzing the risk in order to stay financially strong and have a well-run organization. So I think if you look at it from those two perspectives, reality is usually somewhere in the middle. And so understanding how do we take both perspectives and then come together to be able to paint the future and understand, paint the future is really a way a development officer would say it, but have a better understanding of where we're going in the future as well as today in order to run the organization more efficiently and more effectively, which really just gets to what we're all here for, which is mission support.
And so let me first say that today is the first day that I've heard finance folks referred to as parents of teenagers. So that is something new for me, but I like that analogy very well. And I agree with what Heather said. You know, finance people really look at things in terms of black and white. And I do think that development professionals, you know, see the gray area. And as Tom referenced, you know, 2 + 2 truly does equal 4 for us. And just from a finance perspective, I think when we are looking at the goals of the organization, we're kind of looking at 2 main things. One, we're looking at the impact of what's going to happen to the financial statements, which is governed by generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP. And those to us are very black and white rules that we have to follow in finance, and that's how we first think of things. And then secondly, I think we think in terms of cash flows as well. And I think both of those views are very different from the views that development professionals have to look at, because you're thinking in terms of the donors and the funders and what they want to see. And that's very different from how finance and accounting folks view things.
So thanks, Angela and Heather. how are there common goals, and are there common goals that we have? And I think there's some obvious ones, but are there some other common goals that we should be thinking about to establish and confirm? And then how do you get to those common goals? I mean, I think that, again, in my career, it's felt like finance is in a whole other wing of the institution than development. But I'm curious if you can share your thoughts about, what are those common goals, and how do you work together to really establish them so that we own them together? Angela, why don't you start out this time, please?
Sure, not a problem. So obviously both departments are trying to fulfill the mission. And like we said, it's coming from different views. But what I like to think about when I think of finance and development, we kind of have somewhat of the same goals. So development professionals are out there raising the money, and the accounting and finance departments are managing the money. And so we are both very accountable to the funders and the donors. And overall, what we're both trying to do relates back to the funders and donors. And I think that's, at least from the accounting and finance perspective, that's about 75% of what we do, is making sure that we are accountable and fiscally responsible for our funders. So I think when we think in terms of that kind of changes things, because as I think of the program side of the house, they're more accountable to end users. And so they look at things from a different perspective as well. So I think the more and more that finance and development professionals can kind of focus on that, managing the money together and being accountable to the funders and donors, it kind of changes your view of things. And then we have a lot of things in common in terms of we're both concerned about grant compliance, things of that nature, the reports that are going out to donors and funders. There's several ratios that we're both looking at that I think are common goals. So the two that come to mind for me are self-sufficiency ratio, which tells us how self-sufficient an organization is from its earned revenue from its programs. And then I also think of the program expense ratio, which tells us how much of our expenses are going towards programs versus just our general administrative expenses. So I think when we look at it in terms of kind of those things that we have in common, we work together a lot better.
I agree with what Angela said as well. To me, it truly is a partnership. We need to, as senior leaders within an organization, we need to be saying the same things to different constituencies or the same constituencies. I mean, it wouldn't be any good if the finance committee of the board has a different idea of where things are going financially than the fund development committee or the strategic planning committee. We're serving and staffing different committees, but we need to make sure that those groups are actually hearing the same information and that the priorities are the same, so that then we can have one voice, or else it gets all muddled. And if we're not having the same priorities, it just shows that we're not a well-run organization. I think it's always important. I think it's even more important when times are tough. And we all know we've seen changes due to COVID. If anyone would have said we would have, as we're planning right now, I'm in the process of finalizing the fundraising budget for the fiscal year. And if I would have dreamed 6 months ago of where the numbers are looking versus what I was thinking a year ago, it's a whole different game. So making sure that your finance team is in partnership with you and that they're understanding the opportunities and also the risk gives you a different level of way to share information. I know I've also utilized the finance team to help me think things through for some of my toughest donors, because they may ask and look at numbers a little bit differently than I do, to prepare before I go into some meetings with some donors as well, and have them look at some of the pieces we're looking at sharing and give a different level of visibility to how the numbers are looking or what questions may be asked, so that we can prepare in advance from someone, if I'm working with a CEO of a company who's an individual donor, or a CFO, just to make sure that I'm understanding what questions we may be asked as a team. So I find it's a beautiful blend. It has to be open and transparent with complete trust and understanding of where each person's coming from, but also how to merge those pieces together to be one voice.
Thank you. Let me ask this question. How do you build that trust? And I will preface it by saying, as I said in the beginning, that earlier in my career, I didn't feel that trust and wasn't sure how to build it. So how have each of you built that trust with your counterparts, either in philanthropy or finance, to get that one voice? Thinking of it, at a big level, but even down to the specific tactics that get you to that point.
Sure, and I can start. So I'll actually start with a story. So our Vice President of Development and I have been working together hand in hand, I guess 3 or 4 years now. And he had been there a little bit before I did. But when I started and at my very first Finance and Audit Committee meeting, he was present. And I was surprised because he's not a member of Finance and Audit Committee, and none of the other VPs attend those type of meetings, but he did show up, and he has shown up to every single Finance and Audit Committee meeting for the 3 or 4 years that we have worked together. And in the beginning, he was actually very vocal within those meetings. He was asking questions and making comments. And so, as you mentioned about trust, at first thought, I was kind of confused on why he was asking so many questions and things of that nature. But what I learned is that he was really just trying to learn the information, right? So a lot of development professionals don't understand GAAP and kind of the financial picture that we are looking at. And so by him attending those meetings, that built a lot of trust between us. And then on the flip side, I have attended many donor meetings with him as well, because as Heather mentioned, sometimes you're meeting with somebody who's going to ask a lot of financial questions. And with that, they want to be prepared with the information. So sometimes he would bring me along. And so I really think that has helped to bridge the gap, because I understand the pressures that he is facing when he's talking to a donor and how donors want to hear compelling stories, as well as know that you're financially sound. And on the same side, he understands what happens in a Finance and Audit Committee meeting and how I have to be accountable to that committee and members of the board so that they understand the financial picture as well and know that I'm managing to that and to those standards, not just to what donors and funders want. So I think that helps bridge a lot of gaps. Another example I would give is that I've taught kind of a finance one-on-one class a couple of times, and about 85% of the attendees are always development or fundraising professionals. And when I ask them what is the goal of them attending a finance one-on-one class, their answer is always they want to be able to talk to the finance people within their organizations with a true level of understanding versus just listening to what the finance professionals say without having an understanding. So I would encourage people from the development side to make sure that they are going and talking to the finance side of the organization to just learn as much as possible. And there's not any finance people on the call today, but I do the same with finance people, that they need to understand what's going on the development side as well. And then the last thing I'll say is the finance role has changed over the years. Before, finance professionals were very focused on the books and getting all the numbers together. As things have changed and become more automated, finance professionals are really more of a strategic thought partner now. So I would say early on in the process, when you guys are thinking about new donor initiatives or a large major grant, to get finance involved very early on, because we like those types of projects now, where we are a part of it from the beginning, are helping you think through strategies and making sure that we're aligned from the get-go.
I'll say I've been in the same organization for 9 years at Make-A-Wish, Illinois, and my CFO is also our COO. She wears 2 hats. And she was there over 10 years before I arrived, right? Or 7 years before I arrived. She's been there 17 years. So I came in and they had not had a chief development officer previously. So she had also been an interim executive director at some point. So she understood a little bit more about fundraising. So I think one of the things that I did is I suggested we start meeting outside of the office once a month in the beginning, just to get to know each other a little bit better and understand a little bit more historically. What were some things that went well and what were some pain points? And the only reason we wanted to go outside was so that we weren't distracted. And we started to build trust and vulnerability by sharing with each other different pieces. And then we started building a partnership of how could we support each other through the work. And then it really has carried on through the entire leadership team. We really have a great trust with each other, and we use the strategic planning process on a regular basis in order to continue to build that trust and accountability with each other. But we also keep it real and are very willing to have conversations with each other about the things that are going well, and also if we're not aligned, to deal with it early on. And to keep the conversations going, and to understand things. And so I think it's that level of trust that doesn't happen overnight, but it also doesn't happen by accident. So it's really important to make sure that you're continuing to nurture it and that you are also very much engaging the finance department very early on in all of your thinking as you're moving things forward.
Thank you. I want to drill down a little bit with trustees, because I think for all of our organizations, that's the group that is really important. And Heather, you mentioned it. Can you describe detail, Heather and Angela, how you partner with your colleagues in more detail to make sure that with your board? And I will tell you one example. When I was at Macalester College, we did not work with our finance committee very well. We were preparing for a campaign, a joint meeting between development finance, and boy, did the finance committee just go after us. And I'm getting all red in the face thinking, I made a big mistake here. So I'm curious if you can add a little bit more detail to how you do partner with your trustees, especially the chairs of those 2 committees, but even the chair maybe, to make sure that that one voice is being not only coming from the staff leaders, but maybe from the chairs of those committees and the board itself. And Heather, why don't you start off this time, please?
Sure. I think it starts with strategy. So if you can get a common agreement on your strategy and your direction of where you're going, and then understanding the resources that may be needed to get there, then the rest of it can happen automatically. You then also have to have the right metrics in place to know, are you moving in those directions or not? But it's really ensuring that you're talking, I'm looking at the materials that are going to be shared with the finance committee and making sure that it's aligning with the materials that I'm sharing with the development committee, and that we're understanding the underlying principles underneath what's making up those numbers as well. For example, right now, I mentioned it's budgeting time, but it's also, we're planning a campaign. And so I'm working with my peer, our COO, but we're looking at it from the finance committee as well as the development committee to understand a little bit further about why the funding is needed. So it came out very well when we presented this in front of the board recently, in that it was actually the finance committee chair that backed up the need for the numbers in a different way from reading the books and understanding where things were And actually it wasn't even the chair of the finance committee, it was a member of the finance committee who's always been a quiet board member, but he was the one that answered a question before I got to it from the financial perspective that I think changed the tenor of the conversation in a very good way, because we were all looking at the same numbers and it was all the same conversation, and the need was laid out and explained succinctly and accurately and consistently.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Heather. As she mentioned, it's important to have one voice throughout all the different committees. And I think the way that, we try to make that happen within my organization is that we do all of the reporting, in advance of the meetings and share the reports with each other. And as we're studying kind of the reports and various metrics, we are asking questions internally to make sure that these numbers all make sense and are all giving the same picture. As you all know, there are a lot of times that finance reports and development reports do not have the exact same numbers. But knowing what makes a difference between those reports makes a big difference. So whether it's me talking or the vice president of development, we can both point to the numbers and say, these numbers don't agree because we received, 2 grants where the cash didn't come in and we couldn't count that towards the, accounting numbers, but they're accounted into the development numbers. And so because we both know that reasoning, are using the same voice, a lot of the times we are aligned so that we have the same message to each committee. And then I would also add, similar to Heather, that the members of the committees ask those tough questions to make sure that the numbers are aligned as well. So before we ever have a board meeting, we also have an executive committee meeting. And usually all of the heads of the committees are at that table. And they have various conversations as well during those meetings where they kind of say, hey, we're at the next board meeting, we're planning on approving the budget, and here are the X questions that we have. And so all of that communication happens before we ever get to a board meeting. And so I think by the time we reach that level, all of the reports and all of the numbers and metrics have gone through various vetting processes to the point that we are all aligned and speaking with one voice. And I think that's truly key in order to make sure that there's not an issue at a board meeting.
Thank you. I think both enlightened leaders. I wish I would figured out how to get in link with the finance people earlier, but that sounds great. Let's talk about that. And Angela, you mentioned that sometimes the numbers look a little different between what development is reporting and what finance reports. And I think it comes to bear a lot. I have to say, I remember I was so excited at the end of a fiscal year when I could announce that progress broke records. That was and it just deflated me because cash was actually less than the year before. So it seemed like a down year from him. But I'm curious, and you also said, Angela, both you and Heather mentioned getting in early. I'm curious, I'd love to hear more about how, when most organizations are either in a campaign, planning for the next one, what is the best way, and again, maybe going into more detail about how finance and philanthropy are working together to really set the goal, identify the priorities that need funding, so that in the end, when you claim a campaign success, it's not just on paper, but really in terms of furthering the organization's mission. Go ahead, Heather.
Okay. First of all, I'm seeing some nice comments in chats, private comments. It's not letting me respond, but thanks everyone. It's nice to virtually reconnect with some of you. And others, it's a good turnout here. It's really nice to see so many people interested in this topic. So thanks for everyone's participation in this. In terms of how do you work with the finance department to plan a campaign, I think is the essence of your question, Tom. And then how are the numbers, how can they sometimes tie up differently? You know, there's different levels of, oh, Angela, you're probably gonna have to give more of the specifics than I do, but it wasn't until I was at Make-A-Wish that I understood that some of the gifts I brought in actually were not booked at a full amount if they were multi-year pledges, because there was a discount factor on some of those, and the way that we put some of the fees in are different, and I didn't understand it, and that was probably the reason why I first decided we needed to go to lunch, was because our numbers were not matching. And I was spending too much time early on trying to figure out, why are we off by X amount this month? And now, once we had a common understanding that they were going to be different, and this is why, and I didn't have to worry about those pieces, even though they were what was being presented to the board, what I did need to understand was how we could make sure that if they weren't in alignment, I knew why moving forward. And then some of it really just comes down to a better understanding when you're doing early planning, whether you're looking at a grant proposal. I always want to make sure that the numbers I'm thinking about are matching up from a budget perspective, or from an initiative that we're looking at starting, making sure that there is the funding that's going to be needed on a sustainable basis to move a program forward. Or if we're going to try a new idea, what's the volatility and risk, so that we don't bake it in at 100% of expectations on some of those pieces, and that we have a common understanding. Or if we have a phenomenal year, what is really repeatable and what is not, so that then that doesn't become your new base if there were some exceptional gifts in that specific year to build upon for the future. From a campaign perspective, I think it is also looking at your need and making sure that your financial need is based in reality, not just what you think you can raise, but that there's a succinct and articulated financial need for the investment. Because that's really what we're looking at, is we're looking for anyone that's going to be helping us in a campaign for financial investment and understanding of not only where we are today, but also where we are in the future. So from a development perspective, I'm listening to mission and understanding what the vision is for the organization and where we're heading. I'm then going to think about what pieces of that do I think will resonate most, and how do I package it to get the most mileage from it, from donors. But then I want to make sure that my finance team is working side by side with me to validate. So a lot of times in development, when we think of validation, the only thing we're thinking about is, did we have a feasibility study done? I want to make sure that, yes, feasibility studies need to occur. But in addition to that, there's also the validation that your numbers are needed. Again, it's whether it's a campaign or a grant, because the worst thing I feel I can do is to have a number that's wrong, and then I have to go back to a donor, and instead of thanking them for their investment, I have to go back and explain why money wasn't spent on something. And then I'm not building for the future with the next gift. I'm having to repurpose the present. And I'd much rather spend time working on the next gift than reconfirming that we actually are okay and have a solid relationship in the beginning. So understanding all those components, to me, it's really making sure that the energy that is spent can be spent in a positive way with joy and celebration, as opposed to having to go back and retract.
And so for me, there's a lot of moving pieces that come along with budgeting in general, or looking at any type of new initiative or campaigns. And so for me, the first step is always to talk to the program side of the house to find out what are all of the costs that are actually going to occur that we need to cover through fundraising. And that's whether it's from individual donors or large grants or anything. We need to first understand what those true costs are. And if we don't meet X fundraising goal, how do we scale back on those costs? That to me is the first key thing as a finance professional that I look at. And then once we have those costs, it kind of builds in a fundraising goal that needs to be met. And so then the next step, in my opinion, is always going to the development team to say, is that possible? Is this possible for you to raise? And what sources are you going to go to get these funds? And so that's kind of the process that we go through in my organization. And we have less individual donors. We get more grants from foundations and corporations than we do individual donations. So this may be different from many of your organizations. But so we already have a list of many of the donors that we're going after, because we know those corporations, we know those foundations. And when the development professional builds their kind of development fundraising budget, they do an additional step for me, which is usually telling me what the probability is that they will get those funds from that funder. So if somebody, and I'm just completely making this up, but if somebody tells me they're going to the MacArthur Foundation for a $200,000 grant, that's good. But if you tell me there's only a 25% chance that you're going to get those funds, I'm not going to count that $200,000. I may count a portion of it. I may say 50,000 of this we can count towards our budget, or we can count towards something that we know is a key fundraising piece in this initiative, but I won't count everything. And so I think that is kind of, you know, the very technical process that we go through. But just thinking of it that way. And then there's always the layer of revenue recognition. If you are going to the MacArthur Foundation for this $200,000, is it going to be $200,000 where it's split like a multi-year grant, where they're giving us $100,000 this fiscal year and $100,000 next fiscal year? Because that makes a big difference to the numbers. So again, I think you know, for us, we kind of work in different ways, and each time we add on a layer of different questions until we agree on the numbers and say, okay, this is what we think the campaign is. We're going to have this $1 million goal. We think it's achievable because we're going to X funders to see what they have, and then we're going to go to these new funders and new individual donors to get X percentage of dollars. And that's kind of our secret sauce. It's worked pretty well. We're not always 100% accurate, but I think it makes it easier for us to achieve our goals because we, again, have gone through various scenarios. We have an understanding of when dollars will come in, and we have an understanding that everything that we say might come in is not 100% chance that it is. There's varying differences. So I hope that helps, Tom. I don't know if that's too much detail.
No, that's great. Heather said at the beginning, we tend to be optimists, and so we're going to think, oh yes, that's going to come in, and you bring the realism in it. That I think what's crucial is so much of our work is stewardship. That is so crucial, and if we don't have that finance voice helping us do that, we're going to Heather said it basically, we're setting ourselves up to go back to the donors and not look good, and not on a personal level, but institutionally, and then make it less likely that they're going to be repeat donors. And so that's why the discipline, I will say, and it's not that we're in development aren't disciplined, but you bring a discipline to our practice that I think helps ensure better stewardship. I mean, it's more than just that, but as I think about it. So it was great to hear that. And I guess I want to go a little bit into plan gifts if we could, because more and more as we think about how we get to a campaign goal, they're going to be blended gifts. And so again, we say that our campaign reached the goal, but how much of that is planned gifts, deferred gifts, whether bequests, crats, you name it. And again, I'm curious from both your perspectives, how you've worked with your colleagues in finance and philanthropy to manage that so that in the end, hopefully the financial future of the organization has a position, but we in development are being sensitive to those things. So I hope that rambling question makes some sense. And if it does, I let either one of you start off with it.
Angela, I'll start if that's okay with you. Your question was about planned gifts. I think it's also about timing, which you really didn't talk about per se, but I'm going to throw that one in here, Tom, if that's okay with you. Being on board with your finance person about the timing of when gifts are going to come in, whether it is a deferred gift, it is a multi-year pledge, or in some cases, I know we have a fair amount of events. If the timing of an event has changed, it's really important to make sure your finance team understands so that the liquidity rate stays okay and that they can plan for it and make sure that they have funding in that is at access to cover some pieces if timing of things is changing as well. I would love to say that we have the best plan giving program out there. I would say we're not there yet. So we do get a fair amount of planned gifts that come in the door. In fact, this year, we were very fortunate to have the largest planned gift we've ever received, which was a multi-million-dollar gift that came in. And that gift came in because of a conversation that happened 30 years ago with a staff member, actually 25 years ago with a staff member. So it's the kind of thing that I think is a good example of, and they had actually never made a gift to the organization. 25 years ago, sat down and had a conversation and never wanted to respond to anything again. And then we get a very large estate gift this year. But they followed what the staff person had said to put in their will and estate. Okay, so understanding some sort of rhythm of how are we marking those donors accurately, what revenue maybe we counting now, but it's actually going to be deferred, and understanding those components is really important, as well as for your annual organization. I mean, we've been using a 3-year average, throwing out exceptional gifts, but we use that as a placeholder to start with. And then we also look at what estates are already in probate to double check that along the way. So I think whether you are at a very sophisticated large institution or you're at a small institution, making sure that you have simple available information to talk with planned giving donors, or to make sure that donors who are close to you think about any planned gifts to give to your institution in the future, and understanding that timing with your finance team is critical.
And my organization doesn't get very many planned gifts. As I mentioned, we don't have very many individual donors. We rely a lot more on corporations and foundations just by the nature of what we do. We have individuals who invest in us, wealthy individuals. And so a lot in those terms were included in their estate planning and things of that nature. But just in our general grants and donations, we actually do not receive a lot of that. But I will touch on timing really quickly because Heather brought that up. And the timing really is critical in knowing when you're going to get cash in versus just receiving a pledge or there just being a conversation that somebody says that they will give. And as we're in this global pandemic, cash is king right now for nonprofit organizations. A lot of us have suffered program income losses. And so with that, we really need cash. Most nonprofits keep about 3 to 6 months cash on hand. And so if you started out with just 3 months of cash in March, and now we've gone through these months of this global pandemic, you probably only have a month's worth of cash right now. And that's something that the finance departments are paying a lot of attention to right now is when can we get cash and can you explain to these donors and funders that we need the cash as soon as possible and these are the reasons why. So I'm glad that you brought up that timing because that's something that's really important right now between finance and development.
And I'll ask one more before opening it up to others, if that's okay, Judy. But just paying off of that last point you made, Angela, You know, and I guess maybe this is first focused to Heather. Have you felt that pressure from finance to get the cash or to even use any kind of funds that exist right now that might not be being used to help fund the operations, and whether that's strengthen the relationship between you and your counterpart in finance, or whether that's added some extra stress at times that makes it harder for us to fulfill our donor-centric approach, while at the same time making sure that the institution not only can continue to meet its mission, but in some cases just stay alive.
You want me to start on this one, Tom?
Yes, please.
Liquidity is real. And, you know, where I am, we budget every month. So, I mean, we don't budget every month. We have a budget set for the year, but I'm accountable every single month that are we making our goal or not? And if we're not, for me to be able to explain why. And the why is about, is it a timing issue or is it something more? So I learned very early on, and it was a wake-up call for me because I had been at larger institutions with deeper endowments before I came to Make-A-Wish. And Make-A-Wish, Illinois is incredibly well run. But part of the reason it's well run is because we're looking at it very closely from a financial perspective. So I quickly had to pivot, and instead of thinking about things quarterly, where I was used to, I had to understand it by the ones. At times it can be tense. But that's where making sure your partnership is there and that you are aligned and you trust each other and that you're transparent with where things are. If you do that, it gets you through a lot. Sometimes there's, some donors you could call to pull things in early if you need to. Fortunately, I haven't had to do that, but a lot of my peer chapters have. So it really is just understanding where things are, making sure that you're strong, but also that you're not talking fluff. This is real, and that we need to take it as seriously as the finance department, but to spend a whole lot less time on it than the finance department and spend our time on the phone with donors. And that's really the way we've structured it, to make sure that we're each looking at it from our strength and our strongest position and our level of expertise to be able to work on it together.
That was a great answer. And I'll just add that my department has put a lot of pressure on our development department to go back to the funders and say, yes, we know that the funds were supposed to be used for X, but we need these to be general operating funds right now because we need this cash and we need this liquidity for what we're facing. So we have been putting that pressure on our development team, and I'm happy to say that most donors and funders have responded very well to that because they understand what's going on. They understand the nonprofits need cash, and they understand that the end users of the dollars really need a break right now. So most have been okay with that. And then I would just also add one more thing that we've also been saying to our development team, which is we don't know when these times are going to end. So we've been trying to project out really for the next 1 to 2 years of thinking that we may be in a cash crunch or we may have less program income because we don't know when this is going to end, and kind of asking that our development team think about that. So we're not just thinking about the short term, we need cash, but thinking about this is what may last for 1 to 2 years, and these are going to be our needs for the next 1 to 2 years, and can we express that to the funders and donors?
I'm just going to add on to that. I think that's a really, really good point, Angela. I know when we were doing our strategic planning this year, we actually came up with 4 different scenarios based upon COVID and what might be happening. And then we, as a leadership team, determined which one of those 4 scenarios were we going to be looking at, or for where were we starting out and where we thought we might end. So we decided to do all of our planning around the riskiest box in order to ensure strength in the future. And we also took a wider view to look at the next 2 years or the next year after that as well, to see, are we staying in that, or where do we think it may be going? And again, we took the worst case scenario in order to ensure that we had the right messaging and the right pieces in place, and thought about how the strategy might change, which then shows how the funding may change, so that we were prepared and put all those pieces in our plans. And now we're rolling out the budget based upon the riskiest, as well as the strategy to go along with it. So it also made it so a very uncertain time. You could align on some expectations that we also put in front of the board, so that everyone was on the same page with those pieces in terms of planning. Because planning is nothing but the outcome of that is going to be the financial aspect of it. So that's one way we got through this as well.
I want to thank Mal and my part here. I think you two would be great working together. That's all I have got to say. So I want to take my time to thank both Heather and Angela. I know Judy now is going to help facilitate a few questions, but wonderful comments and feedback and ideas and thoughts.
Yes, a very rich conversation. Thanks to all of you. Angela, you were talking before about the CDO coming to Finance and Audit Committee meetings, and then you going to some of the Development Committee meetings. That sparked a couple of questions. And one has to do with the board and asking the question, should or does someone from the Board Advancement Committee participate on the Board Finance Committee and vice versa? If not, should they? Would that make a difference? I know that you all talked about giving the same messages to each of those committees, but do the committees, are there ever people from the different committees serving on the other?
So
go ahead.
Go ahead, Heather.
No, you go ahead, Angela.
Okay. I was just going to say really quickly, for my organization, we have a development committee, and the chair of the development committee sits on the Finance and Audit Committee. So there is that connectivity, and I think it works very well.
We do not have the connectivity of board members serving on different committees, but the information is shared through the executive committee calls. So it serves the same purpose, but does it with less time. I think the board members we have would not be willing to serve on multiple committees from a time perspective. And I would like to say that I'm okay with that, because I'm already asking time from them in order to help with fundraising of every board member. So I want to make sure that we're being as efficient with their time on any meeting they're in as possible, so that I can still get a piece of it to help make sure we get introductions to other donors.
And that's a good point. I think sometimes when people step up to volunteer, particularly at a high level like the board, I think sometimes we're all maybe a bit guilty of asking them to do another thing and another meeting and another meeting and another meeting, and it takes time. One more question, kind of close to that. Someone wanted to know, Heather, if you have attended Finance and Audit Committee, Audit Department meetings for Make-A-Wish.
No, I don't attend those meetings. And again, I'm comfortable with that. I think it makes sense for us to divide and conquer in our different roles. But as a leadership team, we're clearly working together. But I don't have to be in the room in order to make sure that that happens. The piece about the board development committee, I think might be about recruitment of new board members as well. And for that, I think it's just setting clear expectations of the minimum give-get, but also the reality of what you're looking for. So not just talking about your minimum, but what's the norm as well. So I think you can actually manage things efficiently and effectively, but you don't have to be in all places at one time.
I understand. Yeah, you're right. Angela talked a bit about how her organization sets their budget and how much money needs to be raised. and then she goes to development and says, can you do this? How do you do it, Heather? How do you all approach your budget, setting the budget at Make-A-Wish, Illinois?
So the way we do it is we first start out before a June meeting with a basic framework that is then approved by the board. And then we go through and we do a bottom up and a top down look at it in order to meet the overall goals. So every person on my team is a part of it, and they own their goals and their numbers and their metrics before the year starts. But you start with strategy, and then out of it comes the fundraising and then the implementation.
Okay, okay. And it looks like one other question. It says, the person says, practical question, how are organizations processing paper checks these days, in-house, lockbox? Do you see a time when all giving will be digital?
So I can answer this question. So for us, we do have a lockbox, and we are trying to process things via ACH and wires. I mean, it's very difficult in this time not to try and digitize everything right now. And we've been very frank with everyone that now is the time to not use paper checks. And most people have been okay with that. There's been a few checks where we've had to actually go into the office and receive them and do deposits. And the same way, if we're making any type of payments, there's been a few checks that we've had to cut. But I think more people are embracing digitization. If we think about it, none of us would ever be on a Zoom panel like this before, but I think we're all embracing a new normal.
So Angela and Heather, everybody in your organization is working remotely? There's nobody working in your offices? Is that what I understand?
At Make-A-Wish, Illinois, everyone is working remotely. We do have people that can sign in to go into the office. We have a schedule. We're not allowing in more than one person on any given day. And there's checks in place because of the office building. Angela, I'm going to say I probably have a slightly different view on checks in that I want to make sure that every donor is comfortable with whatever they're doing. And so at times there's donors that would prefer to write a check. I don't want to lose the gift. So I'm instructing the gift officers to make sure that we're also following donors in what they're comfortable with, because I've found that some people are just not going to change. So we do have someone going in the office once a week, and they're actually on a Zoom call so that we have our checks and balances of working together to open envelopes and things like that. But then we're not worrying about having two people in a room together. But when we can, we're asking as many people as possible to go on our website and make the gifts that way. I'm also talking a lot about stock donations right now, since the market is still hot, for people to consider those options. But there's also the piece that I'm receiving more checks right now, because I personally sign every donor thank you that comes through the door. Seeing more checks from donor advised funds than I have ever seen previously in terms of volume of percentage of every one of our batches. So I also want to say to everyone, steward the heck out of the donor advised fund people, because they're the ones that are going to help us get through this time, because the money's already been given and been set aside.
True, true. You're right. Okay, well, by my clock, it's 1 minute after 2. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Mike. But before I do, I again want to thank Tom, Heather, and Angela for taking time out to be with us today. We really appreciate it. You can see in the chat box, and I've gotten a number of personal messages and text messages on my phone, that this was truly a rich conversation, one that everybody got so much out of. Thank you so very, very much for being with us today. And my colleague, Mike Tancredi, will make a few closing remarks. Mike?
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Tom, Angela, and Heather, for this wonderful session. I also want to thank the AFP team and my colleagues on the Continuous Learning Council and this workshop for this wonderful event. That's all the time that we have today. Please remember that evaluations will be sent to you electronically this afternoon, along with a link to the recording of today's program. We will be holding another webinar on Friday, September 11th with more details to come shortly. We have a third Thursday virtual networking event coming up on July 16th, and we have several pop-up meetings coming up, so please watch for those. Please check the AFP Chicago website to register or for more information on each of these programs.
Thanks, everyone. So long and have a great afternoon.
Thank you for joining us and to our presenters, and thank you, Judy. Enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend.
Thanks.